Hi, everybody. I wanted to start off with a little bit about Porphyry and his three questions. So you can see he's a bit of an old timer, 232 to 304 AD. He was a Neoplatonist, so I think he was a student of Plotinus, who's an important figure in Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism was sort of the philosophy of waning antiquity. It's kind of a mix of elements of Aristotelianism and Platonism.
That's Neoplatonism.
Yeah. It very concerned with the problem of universals, but it also tends to verge off into mysticism, sort of a kind of Platonic mysticism at a certain point. But anyway, Porphyry, who's kind of an important conveyor of the problem of universals from ancient times into the Middle Ages, had three questions that he raised in an important commentary on Aristotle that was widely read and was available. People could read it and understand it. Yes, it had been translated into Latin, since Greek was indecipherable at that point to Western Europeans. So he asked, what is the story of these universals? His first question was, do they exist apart from our minds or only in our minds? So this is essentially a question that, depending on what answer you give, marks you off as either a conceptualist or a realist. If you're a realist, you say that universals exist apart from the mind. If you're a conceptualist, you say they only exist in the mind as concepts or ideas or images, mental images or something like that. Right, so dogness for the conceptualist might just be like an image of a dog, a mental picture of a dog we have. Whereas for the realist, it's some kind of entity that's apart from the mind, like a formal structure. The second question was, if they exist apart, right? So if they do exist apart, are they corporeal or incorporeal? So here, who said they were corporeal entities, which means bodily? That would have been Roscelin. Remember, Roscelin said that dogness and universals generally are just puffs of air that come out of our mouths. It's just the sound, that's the universal, or the written inscription, that's the universal. So it's either a graphic design or a sound. That's the universal. Clumps of matter or sound waves make up the universe. Or they might be incorporeal, which is what Plato clearly held, and Aristotle as well. Because what does Aristotle famously distinguish between, anyone know, with respect to an individual? It's matter.
And the hylomorph form.
Yeah, hylomorphism. And hylo is the what? The
form. Or
no.
Yeah, the matter.
Matter, yeah. And the morphism is the form.
Yes.
Okay, so he distinguishes form and matter, so clearly Aristotle would say that forms are not corporeal, because to be corporeal they have to be material. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's only the nominalists like Roscelin who say that universals are actually bodily entities themselves.
So just the boule, not the morphe?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Finally, if they exist apart, do they exist apart from substances or only in substances? Okay, so this would mark off the extreme realist, Plato, from the moderate realist, like Aristotle. The moderate realist says universals do exist apart from the mind. They're not corporeal, but they exist only in substances. That's Aristotle. Whereas Plato says they exist apart from our minds, they're incorporeal, and they only exist apart from substances. Their true essence is apart from the material world altogether, which is why some speak of Platonic heaven or Plato's heaven, where the forms exist. So, yeah. Okay, now let us return back to the traditional arguments for universals. We had gone through the formal cause argument, which you have on the sheet in front of you here. So we don't need to repeat that. I did want to note that there are two other arguments that seem similar that have been advanced as well. They're not exactly the same by any means. So there's the abstraction argument, which says we can perceive that Morris, Felix, and Garfield are cats, and there must be something about them, about Morris, Felix, and Garfield, which accounts for our being able to perceive that all of them are cats. And this something can only be their catness, therefore catness exists. So it's saying basically that we can recognize that things belong to a common category or kind, and there therefore must be some shared kind property, a property had by all members of that kind, which we pick up on, and we identify members as belonging to a common group or kind by perceiving that they share a common quality, like squareness or catness or redness or whatever. So it's saying basically that we couldn't group things into natural kinds unless those things had a shared nature, and we have to perceive that shared nature before we can begin the grouping process. Okay? So to hold this argument is to advocate for what's called an abstractionist theory of concept formation, that we form concepts of things by generalizing or abstracting from our perceptions of particular instances of those concepts. So we learn what dogness is by observing Rover, Fido, Spot, etc., etc. At a certain point, it dawns on a child that there's a common thread. There's a reason why all these things are called dogs. It's because they share some doggish quality. And so, yeah. So we can become acquainted with an attribute by generalizing or abstracting from our perceptions of particular things that exemplify that attribute, according to the abstraction. Yeah.
I noticed that in all these terms, there's a lot of emphasis on the names and the words and the ideas that follow them. Is there a way that these universals can exist outside of language, or it's restricted only to language? Universals.
Well, so far these arguments haven't said anything about language. It's only the third one, the linguistic argument, that brings in language.
Okay.
But the formal cause argument says the existence of these things belonging to a common category, dogs, cats, tables, whatever, requires that the things have a common nature. So it's not saying anything about language. And the abstraction argument is more about knowledge. How do we know that these things belong to that kind, to a common group? How do we know that Rover, Fido, and Spot are dogs, that Felix, Garfield, and Morris are cats, and so on? Because when we say that they're all cats, we're saying that somehow they're all the same. Yet they're different things, right? Morris is one thing, Felix is another thing. Yeah, so what makes them the same if they're different? They must share something that's the same. I mean, that's the reason. Right? Yeah. Now, the third argument does appeal to language, and that's the linguistic argument. So what it says is that the term cat, or any other general term, denotes or refers to Morris, Felix, Garfield, all these individuals. And there must be something about those individuals, about Morris, Felix, and Garfield, which accounts for the term cat denoting all of them. Now, there was a term cat, which is a general term, somehow gathers up all these things. And how does it do that? Saying there must be something about the individuals that connects them to the word. Because the word doesn't connect to other things like Rover, Fido, and Spot. So what is there about Morris, Felix, and Garfield that connects them to cat that doesn't also connect Rover, Fido, and Spot to cat, but rather to dog, which doesn't in turn relate to Morris, Felix, and Garfield? So it seems like there's something about cats that allows the word cat to talk about them, and there's something about dogs that allows the word dog to talk about them, and so on and so forth. And what is that? Well, this something can only be, in the case of cats, the catness. So therefore, catness exists. So according to those who favor the linguistic argument, what they're saying is that the meaning of a general, they're hypothesizing that the meaning of a general term, and a general term would include nouns, not names, but common nouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, prepositions even. The meanings of these terms are properties or relations that are signified by the terms.
When you say names, you mean like proper names?
Yes.
Okay.
They're not proper names, but they could be names of kinds.
Right, like cat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but not like Morris.
Yeah.
You know, Morris clearly refers to an individual, not to catness or any other property. Refers to that fluffy.
Right. Morris the cat could be different than just Morris, right? In terms of
yeah.
like what it refers to, right? Like I could say Morris was here earlier today.
Yeah.
You're like, well, was Morris a human?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, you would, unless you knew
Right.
which Morris.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wouldn't Wittgenstein depart from this in terms of definition by saying it's only in context to the sentence itself?
Yeah. He's not a believer in universals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Correct.
Facts.
He doesn't go for abstract universals. Right, so a general term, according to this argument, denotes certain objects. So like cat denotes Morris, Felix, and Garfield. If and only if that term signifies a quality which each of those individuals possesses. So what it's saying is that properties are the connector between words and things.
Properties are the connector between words and things.
Yeah, what connects words to things, right? So we have this language, right, full of words. The words are arbitrary constructs, right, because different languages all have different words, okay? So something's got to connect up the words we use to the thing. So this theory says that what connects them is that we use properties as the connectors. The meanings of the words are the properties. We decide to use certain sounds or linguistic symbols to represent certain properties. Like we use cat to represent catness and dog to represent dogness and so on. And then those properties are had by those things as a matter of their nature.
Okay. Yeah.
And so then that connects the linguistic items to the objects.
Okay.
Could you reiterate that last piece? I got lost.
Yeah, so you have these things out there, right? Morris, Felix, and Garfield.
Yes.
They're concrete, particular objects.
Yeah, like we've already talked about.
Right. And according to the formal cause argument, right, they share a property.
They all share property.
Yeah.
That's not contingent on language, it's just the universal
That's
itself.
yeah, it's because that's how they can exist in the first place.
Okay.
Like that's their essence or nature or something, right?
These essences exist outside of language.
Yeah.
We just so happen
They're in the
to
things.
sign language.
They're in the things, yeah. Yeah.
We connect words.
So dogs don't have to be called dogs. They could be called pedo or something.
Right. It's
Or hunt.
the referent is the thing that matters, not necessarily the sense.
This, yeah, the sound doesn't, the sound's arbitrary. But still something's got to connect it. Given that it is arbitrary, then you need a connector because there's no natural connection.
These linguistic beings.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
No, so we decide, I mean, we have a lexicon where, a dictionary where we lay out that these sounds signify such and such properties.
Yes.
They point to those properties.
Yeah, and then those properties are had by those things. So then those words refer to those things that have the properties that are the meanings of those words.
Right.
And what are the meanings? They're these form properties.
So what's,
Now, do those properties exist in heaven or on earth? Aristotle says they exist on earth. Plato says they exist out there somewhere.
that's what I was
Yeah.
considering.
Yeah.
And those, that's.
And the nominalist says, no, there's just the sounds.
Right.
So the properties do not exist to the nominalist?
Right,
Okay.
yeah. Maybe concepts exist, because not all sounds have meaning. So there's like the babbling of a brook or of a parrot, like saying something that has no idea what it's saying, right? It's not clear that those things really mean what they might seem to mean. Yeah,
So what about universal relations?
same story. So if you have a preposition, the book is on the table, the hat is on the table, the keys are on the table.
The cat is on the map.
Edinburgh is north of
The cat is on the cat is on the table, all these things. So you have 3 or 4 examples of the in relation, and there's got to be something about the word in, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That makes it refer to all of these different pairs.
Doesn't that
And that can only be the relation of in.
doesn't that defeat
Or, I mean,
the,
it's on, right?
on,
Yeah.
right. Does that defeat the conceptualist argument of they exist in our minds? Because it seems like even if my mind wasn't here, the relation of book on table would remain, right? Independently from me perceiving it.
Yeah.
So that kind of is a defeater for them, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not clear how they would handle that.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm confused with your question. Can you elaborate?
So, yes, so we can take the example of North Carolina is north of South Carolina.
Right.
It doesn't, you don't have to have someone alive to perceive the spatial relation. So north of, North Carolina would still be north of South Carolina, even
Regardless if you were inside North or South Carolina.
even if you weren't here.
Yeah.
Like if you didn't exist, North Carolina would still be above South Carolina.
These are just facts.
It's a universal relation of north and south.
Okay.
So independently from the things, north of remains.
True.
So it has to be universal.
Okay, that's good. I understand.
Well, there's more to say about this. So.
Yeah, right. That's not necessarily bulletproof, but
Right. So there are 3 levels of argumentation. There's the metaphysical argument that things cannot be in groups. There cannot naturally exist kinds in the world unless they share some common property. That's the formal cause argument. There must be a formal basis in things for their belonging to a common group, like a species, like dogs or cats, whatever. Second argument is we have no way of recognizing that things belong to these kinds without grasping or apprehending the shared quality. It says that we have perceptual knowledge that things belong to these groups, and to know that, to have that knowledge, we'd have to apprehend the quality that they share,
Okay.
to sort them out into these different groups, and know the difference between dogs and cats and tables and all these different things. Okay, and the third argument says that the connection between words and things requires universals as the connector between the two via a theory of meaning, which explains how words can have meaning and then can explain the reference of those words, which are the... So the meaning is the universal, the property or the relation. The reference are the objects in the world that exemplify the meanings.
And the senses, the sounds.
The which?
The senses are like the utterances that point to.
Well, they're just utterances. I mean,
Yeah. We don't have to use that.
vocalizations, inscriptions, utterances.
Well, then I guess I'll just say no.
Yeah.
Now, Frege uses the term sense to refer to the universal aspect.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm still kind of confused with what Ryan was saying. So does that just apply to the fact that the names of North Carolina and South Carolina have like the cardinal attribute in their name? Or does that still apply, say, like North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, where you have states that don't have the direction implied there?
Yeah. I suggest we just hold off on this for a minute, and I think Russell lays out an argument for why relations are special, and it bears on the argument we were talking about last time about the trope resemblance theory, which said, if I can refresh your memories, that I'm going to erase it there. Yeah. So according to the trope resemblance theory, we don't need these common natures. We can make it all work with particular qualities which are not shareable. We still need qualities, but they're going to be concrete individual things themselves, like the redness of this apple, which is thought of as an object with spatiotemporal attributes, spread out, an expanse of red, an expanse of roundness. So all of these exist as different particular qualities, together with the idea of resemblance. So we're going to say that Rover has his own dogness, which is not shared by any other dog. It's unique to Rover. And Fido's got his unique dogness, and Spot his unique dogness. Right? But that these different dognesses have a resemblance. And it's in virtue of that resemblance that we can put all dogs into the same group.
You asked me that at the end.
Well, each dog has a dogness, right? And these dognesses are very similar to each other. So together then, through the resemblance of each dogness to each other dogness.
Okay, so regardless if it's a Chihuahua or a German Shepherd, they still own and take the property of dogness.
Yeah.
Resemblance of dogness.
Yeah.
Even though they physically look very different, they
Yeah.
still have the dogness. Okay.
Yeah, but each has his own, but they're similar to each other.
Yeah, each has its own property. Like a Chihuahua is not a German Shepherd.
No,
However, they
no, but even like Rover and Spot aren't exactly the same, because one has spots and the other one doesn't have spots, right? Right?
Yeah.
One has straight hair and the other has curly hair and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. Understand.
So it's rare to find two that are exactly identical, perfectly resembling,
Tokens and
but it's
stuff.
theoretically possible to have perfectly resembling objects. But even then, they would each have their own unique quality, which perfectly resemble each other.
I'll ask something else different. I have an ox hours questions about perfection.
You know, perfectly resembling just means that there's no difference between the qualities they have, except that they're in different places. So if you had two, like, perfectly resembling spherical particles, like,
If
yeah, if no one knows whether you have that or not, but according to science, there's no difference between one electron and another electron. They're all perfectly interchangeable. The differences only arise when you start arranging them, right? But the basic building blocks, if that's true, right? If that's so, then you could say they have perfect resemblance, that the roundness of one particle perfectly resembles the roundness of the other, but they're still two different particles because they're in different places. Different roundness, different sphericities because they're in different places at the same time.
on a quantum mechanical level.
Yeah, at whatever level you have to go, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if that's all true, and if they're different from each other, so be it. Then they were back to just regular resemblance rather than perfect resemblance. Right? And frankly, no one knows. Right? But it seems logically possible to have perfectly resembling things.
That's debatable, but continue on.
Yeah. Well, Leibniz argued you couldn't, but he said that's because God loves variety. So that's a theological argument. So he'd first have to prove that God exists to make that argument, which is hard to do. Right? Not just any old God, but a perfect God who loves, right? Who nevertheless loves variety so much that he never makes any things perfectly resemble, even though he's perfect. Right? Because it would get too boring or something. Everything were perfect, according to Leibniz. You got to have a balance of like variety and conflict and harmony and all kinds. Have to all coexist. Yeah.
I have a question for the linguistic argument. So just to think about it like in a scenario, for an example, there's Rover, Fido, and Spot.
Mm-hmm.
And you're standing next to somebody who says, "Bring me that dog."
Mm-hmm.
And you would say, "Which dog?"
Mm-hmm.
Because in Rover, Fido, and Spot, they have to have the dogness property. So that's why it's unclear why if someone said, "Bring me that dog," they all share the common characteristic of dogs, so dogness has to exist, because it's not, they all have to have something in common for the other person to ask which dog. But if they were to say, like, "Bring me Spot," that's a unique particular instance of dog,
Right.
which the person could bring over. But it's not clear which dog they're referring to, because all three of them
Right.
are dogs, they all have dogness.
Right.
So dogness exists.
Oh, well, the novelist could just say it's just an ambiguous statement.
Right, okay.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, that's good, actually.
All right, so the resemblance novelist says we don't need these shareable universals. We can make do just with non-shareable, particularized qualities called tropes. They call them tropes. That's the trope resemblance theory. Okay. So Russell argued that you get into trouble on this theory when you talk about relations. So here's. Okay, so you're going to have some dogs here.
That's a great dog.
This is Spot the dachshund. Okay, so suppose you just have two, right? So then you're going to say that they resemble each other, right?
Yes.
The particular dognesses of them resemble two. They're pretty much alike. There's some differences. Overall,
They have four legs, they have a tail, they have the nose.
they have a lot in common. They have a lot in common. Dietary needs, genetic code, all this stuff is similar.
Ancestral
All this stuff is very similar. So that gives you dogness 1 and dogness 2, which resemble each other. Okay. Right? But now Russell says resemblance is a relation.
Resemblance is a relation.
Yes. So if you have two other dogs, okay, over here, then you're going to have dogness 3 and say dogness 4 for this other dog here.
That's action.
These are also going to have their resemblance, right?
Yes.
So now how do you know what resemblance is?
There has to be dogness, right?
No, the first question was how do you know what dogs are? And the answer to that is, well, they all share similar dognesses.
Right.
But now you're going to ask, how do I know what resemblance is? Okay. And so you're going to have to say that the resemblance between these two resembles the resemblance between these two. So you get a resemblance, a particular relation. It can't be a shared relation, because then we're back to universals. So there has to be a specific, particular spatiotemporally located relation that's floating out in space between these two, and another one that's out there between these two, and those two resemblances resemble each other. Okay.
The resemblances resemble each other.
Yeah, so it gets really hairy at that point and starts looking not so straightforward as it did to begin with. You have to have resembling resemblances.
Isn't that like the problem of the form of equality with Plato, where like
Yeah, you get like the third relation.
Yeah.
Wait, repeat that again? Repeat that again?
like Plato has this. I hope I remember it. Has this problem.
The third man argument.
Yeah, the third man argument. Aristotle points it out, right?
Right, if you have two men and you say that they're both men by virtue of partaking of manhood,
Yeah.
and manhood is a man itself, like a heavenly man, then what makes manhood also a man? Well, that must be like meta manhood, meta manhood, and so on.
But it's not what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right?
Ad infinitum.
Yeah, ad infinitum, yeah. Yeah, so it seems like you get into the ad infinitum relation, a particular relational problem. Okay, so maybe there are a lot of relations. But Russell says that it affects, in particular, I mean, it might be harmless. You might just say, well, and that's how mathematics is generated or whatever. We need infinity somehow, so maybe we can get it here. What Russell sees as the big problem here, I think, is that in order to know that an object is of a certain sort, like that something is a dog, okay? According to the trope theory, you've got to first find some dogs, right? And then you've got to observe resemblances between, right? The tropes of this dog and that dog and so on. So you have to have like your archetypical dog, whatever, that you
Archetypal.
yeah, thank you. Archetypal dog that you identify as your paradigm.
Ooh, that word paradigm's good.
Yeah, as your like paradigm or proto dog, right? And then you've got to observe that he's got a particular dogness, which like resembles other particular dognesses, and so on and so forth. And then you're asked, well, how do you identify this as resemblance as opposed to some other relation, like on or above or below or whatever? Then you have to say, well, I observe this particular resemblance here, which is my archetypal, see, I got it right that time, my archetypal resemblance relation, and then you've got to compare it to other ones and so on. And it seems like you're going to get lost in the regress here of infinitely ascending relations, and you'll never be able to know that anything is of any sort whatsoever, unless you bring in like direct apprehension of a common relation, at least. Unless you know what resemblance is in general from the get-go. How are you going to do this?
Right.
That's what Russell thinks. You know? So this is the early Russell before he rejected universe in his more metaphysical stage, when he was influenced by G.E. Moore.
So I love you.
He argues that we're going to get this nasty regress. It's a cognitive regress. I mean, it's not being put forward as a problem for the formal cause kind of argument. Where you say, what makes them all dogs? Well, there might be an infinite regress. There seems to be one in Platonism too, as he pointed. I mean, in realism as well, right? As you pointed out, right? For the Platonist or the Aristotelian, you may get an infinite regress of properties rather than relations. Okay, but it doesn't seem like you need to bring in these other properties to know what red is or dog is to begin with. Whereas it seems like you have to make these comparisons between different objects to do it on the trope theory. And it looks like you're going to have to complete this infinite regress before you can identify anything as a dog, which you don't have the time to do. Because you've got to compare right? Before you could compare the dogs to other dogs, you got to compare this resemblance to other resemblances, right? And they have their resemblances too, right? So there's going to be like another third order resemblance, right? And you can't even do that cognitively. Like, who can even think what the resemblance of particular resemblances of other particular resemblances even is, right? I mean, yeah, I think we can do like the first level, okay. We can say that the resemblance between these two is like the resemblance between those two. You go up one more level and we get lost, I think, in trying to actually cognize what we're talking about. Yet you would need to go up and up and up and up and up for a very long time, like forever, in order to say then that Rover is a dog. That's Russell's argument. So it says we have to bring in relations as universals which we directly apprehend. All right, so that's Russell's argument against resemblance nominalism. You can find a discussion of it in the book under Russell at the end of the article. There's a discussion of his objection. So you have a look at that. Okay, another argument for universals was put forward by Aristotle. Not surprisingly that he'd be arguing that. But he says that the possibility of logical demonstration by means of which he had in mind syllogistic arguments, like all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. The syllogism in Barbara, as it's called.
Oh, logic. Okay.
Yeah, all A's are B's,
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
all B's are C's, therefore all A's are
C.
C's, yeah. Like all men are animals, all animals are mortal, all men are mortal. Yeah. So how would that argument go? He's saying that in order for the premises to logically entail the conclusion, we have to be able to predicate one thing of many. We have to be able to say that all dogs are dogs, or that all animals are mortal, or whatever. So he says we really can't understand how these logical forms can be valid, logically valid, unless we presuppose the reality of universals, things that can be predicated of many. Because we have to say that all men are mortal, for example, or all men are animals, all these kinds of things. So we're predicating a general term, one term of many objects.
Like all 4 dogs are dogs.
Yeah, or all men are animal.
This just takes me back to the Frege's token in type 3.
Yeah. So, because you have to have a necessary truth which says that for any properties A, B, and C, if all things that have A have B and all things that have B have C, then all things that have A have C. So there's going to be this necessary truth about the form vis-a-vis the properties involved in applying the form. So the thing that makes the syllogism in Barbara, that all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's, valid, is that it's a necessary truth that it's a necessary truth that for properties A, B, and C, if everything that has A has B and everything that has B has C, then everything that has A has C. So, yeah.
When he says predicative, does he mean only identity statements?
No, he's talking about predication. So it's when you say that a thing has a property or quality.
Right. So it's not just statements like A equals B,
No.
B equals C, C equals A. Okay.
No.
Okay.
No, these involve predications of a genus, involving a species and a genus. So man is a species of a genus, which is animal, and so animals more general. So could the truth be captured just in terms of language? Could you say it's a necessary truth that for any predicates, A, B, and C?
Are you saying capture it or know it?
Well, capture. I mean, is logic just about language or is it about universals? It doesn't seem to be a necessary truth about the linguistic items.
Right.
Because language is conventional. It is what our signs signify is conventional, so it wouldn't seem to be necessarily true that the form would hold if we were just talking about the words. It is if you're talking about properties, though. If everything that has property A has property B, and everything that has property B has property C, then all the things that have a property A must have property C. All right, so that was the argument about demonstration. Let me talk a bit about Plato's account of forms and why it's no longer as popular as it was in ancient Greece. It's largely because of criticisms that Plato himself brought up, and which then inspired Aristotle to come up with a different theory. So Plato had said that if you have things on earth, like a bed, and you have two beds, so Plato wants to say that there's an ideal form of the bed, in virtue of which all earthly beds are beds. So there's like this ideal heavenly bed. It's like the perfect bed.
What is this called again? I know that it's
The
like
theory of forms.
There it is. Okay. I just wrote that down because I know there's like a chart you can look up even.
Plato's theory of forms. So he said there's this heavenly bed. It's like the perfect bed. I guess it's got a really great mattress and stuff.
It has the perfect mattress, right?
Yeah, an
It does
amazing,
every
Yeah.
function.
an amazing headboard.
The perfection of a headboard.
Yeah, it has to be so perfect that everything is a reflection, like a poor reflection of its perfection.
Yeah, so like
The
the
material is insufficiently.
Yeah, nothing really quite grasps the form because the form is the perfect representation that.
yeah, so these earthly beds are like inferior craftsmanship. And stuff.
The material.
Shadows, yeah.
Well, the heavenly bed was crafted by God or the artificer or some like really a being very high up in the celestial hierarchy.
Mattress part of God.
Right. So, yeah, you can analogize it to shadows and an original object. So, like an earthly dog might cast shadows, so there could be shadows of Rover. And those would indicate, those would resemble Rover to some degree, but they wouldn't actually be real dogs. So, like, there's this transcendental bed, which is like, way better. Truly a bed, and these things are kind of reflections or fallout of that.
If we, unlike Aristotle's theory, if we took away all the earthly beds for Plato's theory, he would still hold that the form's still
Yeah, the form's still there, it doesn't care that
Yeah.
these things are all like second class.
Theoretically, are there forms that do exist within Plato's theory that don't exist in the material world?
At all. Yeah.
We just haven't discovered them yet.
Or they just haven't been even been conceived by the human mind?
They
but
could
these forms do
yeah.
exist according to Plato.
Yeah, there could well be
Yeah.
forms like that. Or there might be forms of different animals.
Like the mammoths that went extinct.
Or like unicorns. Right? Like unicorns are like heavenly creatures. They can't be seen except by like really good people. If they touch you with your horn, you're blessed for life. Okay. You'll have amazing good fortune if the unicorn gently like
Nuzzles you.
nuzzles you and tips its horn onto your forehead. Yeah. Stuff like that, right? Right, they could be. Yeah, so there might be unicorns like that in Plato's time. Yeah,
So anything possibly conceivable is.
Yeah. yeah, there would be a form.
Of course, like in Parmenides, he seemed to back away when Parmenides asks if things like hair and mud have a form, right?
Yeah, okay, so what about, like, let's have a look at that. That's an important filth. Okay.
That is a good one, so especially. Or like, didn't Aristotle say that things like manifest, such as leeches and like flies
Yeah.
and stuff?
Okay, so just take filth, right? Disgusting, vile filth. So, according to this theory, then, so there's earthly, like, piles of disgusting, unspeakable filth laying around, right?
Yeah, there's true.
And so they have to be like a reflection of some, like, ideal, like, perfect filth. But then heaven becomes infested with this, like, perfect filth, which seems incompatible with celestial values. So there seems to be a problem. It seems like those things really can't have a form. That calls the theory into question, right? That earthly things, that a number of earthly things fall under a common predicate or kind or category, only as shadows of perfect forms, because then they'd have to be an even more vile form of filth that exists in heaven, which, how can that be?
Especially if heaven has like the perfect trash can. That they're just not
Yeah,
using.
yeah, the whole thing becomes bad. So these were among the reasons that Plato began to become suspicious of his own account. And so, like, Aristotle was studying with him as a student, and he picked up on that, and he came up with a whole different thing. So let's get rid of this Platonic heaven idea altogether and just say that the universals are immanent within nature. So, yeah, that's kind of how it happened. That Greek thought changed from endorsing these otherworldly universals to universals in re, in things. The theory doesn't seem to make any sense when it comes to filth. Another thing that wouldn't make any sense is change. Suppose you have a bunch of changing particulars, like candles that are burning, right? So they would all have in common this universal of change.
They all must change in order to be candles which can burn that melts.
Yeah, and they all are changing, right? As they burn, they're changing, right? They're melting. Yeah, so then there has to be a form of that in heaven, which would be perfect change. But that's a contradiction because Plato says change is imperfect by definition, that the forms are unchanging. So you get into a contradiction, not just with nasty things, but also with anything Plato regards as a sign of imperfection, including change. So it looks like mutability becomes, a form of mutability becomes incoherent. It's got to be both mutable and immutable, because all forms are immutable, so the form of mutability is both mutable and immutable, which is a contradiction. So, like the theory of forms is bad, yeah. Did you have a?
University.
Oh, yeah. Uh, Yeah, so another one is the form of being a non-form. So all earthly objects are not forms, right? Yeah, by definition, like
Yeah.
hats and books and keys and laptops and stuff. So they all share non-formedness, unformedness, non-formedness. So what they must have in common is that universal ideal object of non-formedness, which must be the perfect non-form, must be the form of being the perfect non-form.
So,
Contradictory.
no, I have a question though.
Yeah.
Is there, according to Plato's concept, a Platonic form of the concept of the form? It's getting a little like meta.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, so there would be a form. All forms are formed, so they are formed. So the formedness is a form that all true beings possess.
Like, is the human concept of form incorrect? Because that in of itself is a material concept created by material beings. So the correct theory of forms is not available unto humans because we're material.
Yeah, well, you could say that, but then you get off into mysticism, because then what's the theory? If we can't understand the theory,
If we can't conceive of a theory.
if we can't conceive of the theory that's being proposed, then how do we know what theory is being proposed and what we're even talking about? So you have to have this like mystical postulate that there's this mystical realm of things beyond human comprehension in which there is utter perfection, but we can't understand what we're talking about when we talk about that. And then it's not clear how that theory explains anything about our world, or even what the theory is. But even if the theory is meaningful, it doesn't seem to explain anything, since you can't understand the explanation. Right?
One more time, sorry. That was.
Yeah, I'm saying if you,
Just say that same sentence one more time.
no, I'm just saying if you believe in some mystical realm of utter perfection and unity, or whatever, a Platonic realm of some sort like that, which was beyond human comprehension, then it's certainly not going to explain like why all beds are beds or anything like that, because you don't understand the explanation.
Another issue of Plato's theory is, did Aristotle specifically point that out, or?
Well, he just pointed out that the theory that you're going to get all these contradictions and infinite regresses and things, and said it's better to locate universals in the things, and we don't have to worry about the relationship between a heavenly realm and the earthly realm. We don't have to say that the earthly realm is somehow unreal and strange things.
Did the Neoplatonists fix any of this? No, they just said like, yeah, perfect non-form. That's
I mean, the Neoplatonists could argue.
They were Aristotelians,
Oh, really? Oh, yeah.
right. Okay.
and some of them brought in God as part of the scheme. So they became universals became ideas in the divine. Universals became ideas in the divine mind.
Okay.
So then it's a different picture than Plato's. It's a hybrid.
Like Aquinas.
It's a hybrid. Well, no, more like I say, Plotinus and others. It's kind of like I say, a hybrid between Aristotelian and Platonic ideas.
Okay.
Yeah. So Aristotle's big move was to say instead of ideal objects like the perfect bed and the perfect triangle and the perfect pile of filth and all this stuff,
Yeah.
right? Instead of ideal objects, we're going to have properties. So, I mean, Plato's theory kind of mixes together objects and forms because the forms are themselves ideal examples of objects, like an idealized bed or something. Where Aristotle says we shouldn't think of forms that way, we should think of them as properties, in which case the property of bedness is not a bed, perfect or otherwise. It's not a bed at all, it's the property of being a bed. You may ask, well, what is that? Well, the one thing it isn't is a bed. So beds are these things made of wood, and the property of being a bed is the structure or the form that the wood embodies, right, for Aristotle. So he distinguishes sharply between properties and the things that may have them, whereas for Plato, you've got this shadow model, right, that the true object is the form, and the earthly things are shadows or reflections of the form. So Aristotle has a more sophisticated understanding, and that leads to paradoxes. So Aristotle's got a more sophisticated understanding, saying that these are attributes of things, but that he places those attributes within the things. Platonists who come later want to say that the attribute can exist without the object. It may be an unexemplified attribute, like the example of shapes that are never found on Earth.
Right. And
So that's still an issue. That's still a live issue.
what about numbers?
Yeah, well, numbers are a whole other.
Yeah.
We have enough problems with properties, so let's just stick.
Yeah. Well, I just don't find numbers and properties.
The hope is that numbers can be understood as properties if we can figure out what properties are.
Right.
Yeah, so ideal objects versus properties. So properties seem less problematic. They're less exotic. We sort of know what properties are. We know that like a number of different pieces of paper are red. They all share this property of redness. We don't have to imagine some kind of transcendent ideal world out there to understand that. Right? We see that each of the samples of red embodies that property. So Aristotle explains it by saying that the matter, each of these pieces of matter, is formed and has the same form. The form is the property. Yeah, so it's a very intuitive and much less problematic way of understanding the relationship between substances and their attributes. Plato says that the things we think of as substances aren't real substances, they're sort of shadows of the true substances, and the true substances themselves are these perfect idealized entities, which then seems to collapse under its own weight. Since we have these perfect idealized things of change that can't change, and filth that's not filthy. Doesn't make any sense, right? Yeah. So Plato himself abandoned his original account, it seems.
Would you say that Socrates transformed it into soul?
Who?
Socrates.
Well, Socrates was first. He was Plato's tutor. So,
So would souls have,
yeah, Plato allowed for souls.
yeah,
Plato saw souls as kind of midway between earthly things and forms.
okay.
They have some attributes of each. So they undergo change, that makes them like earthly things.
Mm-hmm.
But they're eternal, which makes them like the forms.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. They're kind of like a midway, transitional case.
Evolution.
Interestingly, even if we move to properties, away from the ideal objects, we're still going to get some of these problems unless we're careful. some of these problems with incoherent properties. One important example of this is if you consider that some properties exemplify themselves. An example of a property that exemplifies itself is the property of being a property.
Wait, repeat that again?
Take the property of being a property.
Okay.
All properties have that property,
Oh, wow.
right? Okay.
That's a concept.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're self-exemplifying.
Every property is a property?
Yeah. Every properties belong to the class of properties in virtue of all sharing the property of being a property. Yeah, so that property has itself.
Is this like a Hephaestus argument? or
No,
is it-
no, not yet. This is just like properties have that property right now. Most properties like don't have that property.
Properties have the property of being a property.
Yeah, yeah. But most properties aren't like that. Okay, like take square. Yeah, according to Aristotle, squareness doesn't have the property of being square. Only objects do.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we wind up with Plato's view that everything's an ideal object, right? That there's a perfect square and a perfect dog. If we say that all these properties have themselves. So what's usually said is that they don't. The only one, it seems like, that must is something like being a property. Also the property of being self-identical.
Like the Hephaestus or?
Yeah, well, property of being self-identical is itself self-identical. So it's self-exemplifying. But the problem doesn't come with the properties that are self-exemplifying. It comes actually with the other properties, the ones that aren't self-exemplifying, like being a dog, being red, being square. Right? There's no need to say those exemplify themselves. If we do say it, we'll go back to Plato, right? That we got all these perfect objects up there, which we don't want to say. Yeah, we don't want that. So we got to say, we're forced to say it for like the property of being a property and the property of being self-identical. So we have to admit it there. The problem comes in what is it that all things that don't exemplify themselves have in common? So what do all things that don't exemplify themselves, that are not self-exemplifying, have in common? So if you go with the formal cause argument, right, you want to say like when Rover, Fido, and Spot are all dogs, they share some property which makes them all dogs. So what about all things that don't exemplify themselves? So what are some things that don't exemplify themselves? This hat, right? Book, keys, the property of being red, property of being square. They don't exemplify themselves, okay? Assuming that only objects are square and not properties, okay? There's this whole class of things that don't exemplify themselves, right? Mainly physical objects. Following me? So they don't exemplify anything, right? They're not exemplifiable. They're not exemplified by
Oh,
anything.
like colors.
No, like tables, right? Only properties are exemplified, right? Only properties, but not objects, right?
Gotcha.
Like you and me, we're not exemplified by anything. But humanity is, right? Namely by us. But nothing exemplifies us because we're not properties. So what do we all have in common that makes us all not exemplified? Must be the property of being non-self-exemplifying, right?
Yeah.
That's a property shared by all non-self-exemplifying things. So there's a property of being self-exemplified, right, which is had by being a property. And then there would be the property of being non-self-exemplified, exemplified by hats and coats and so forth. And maybe lots of properties too.
But that would mean that we do exemplify.
Yeah, so
Why do we not exemplify?
being non-self-exemplifying. But it turns out there can't be this property. And so there can't be any explanation of why things are all non-self-exemplifying in terms of they're sharing a common property. Why can't there be this property? Because this property would both have to exemplify itself and not exemplify itself, which is a contradiction. Why would it have to exemplify itself? Well, consider the two possibilities. Consider the possibility that being non-self-exemplifying does exemplify itself, then it will be non-self-exemplifying. Okay. On the other hand, consider the possibility that it doesn't exemplify itself, right? If it doesn't exemplify itself, then it's also non-self-exemplifying,
Yeah.
right?
Things we would never know.
So if it exemplifies itself, then it doesn't. If it doesn't exemplify itself, then it does. So this property can't exist.
Yeah, that's weird.
So what explains why all these objects here don't exemplify themselves? If nothing explains it, then that's a encouragement to the nominalist.
Oh,
I mean, if there can't be an explanation. Because then you can say it's all brute. If we can't explain it. But maybe we can explain it. Maybe we can say there's the property of being self-exemplifying, and what explains all these other things is lacking that property. So, and say that what makes all books non-self-exemplifying is the fact that each lacks the property of being self-exemplifying. And that property leads to no paradoxes. The property of being a property, the fact that it exemplifies itself, is harmless. It's only the non-self-exemplifying property that creates the paradox. This is similar to Russell's paradox, which was the paradox of the unique set, right, which contains all and only those sets which are not members of themselves. The set of all sets which are not members of themselves. The set of all sets which are not members of themselves. The question is this set a member of itself or not? It must be one or the other. Trouble with this set is that it's way too big. The set of all sets which are not members of themselves. So if it is a member of itself, it's not. And if it's not a member of itself, it is. So yeah, it's a lot like this property being non-self-exemplifying.
I don't think I understand the concept. Can you run it once? I don't think.
Which concept? The set of all sets or the?
No, the non-exemplifying. I think I'm confused. 'Cause
Okay, so here.
maybe an example would help.
Yeah, so you've got some objects. Objects don't get exemplified, only properties. Objects are like you and me and stuff, right?
Objects don't get exemplified, only properties.
Yeah, only properties get exemplified.
So it's like the first idea. Okay.
Yeah. Right. So like you're an object. No one exemplifies you. You're not like redness or something. You're not shareable, right? Nor am I or anyone else.
So because we are objects, we're non-exemplifying?
Yes, just for that simple reason.
So no one can exemplify me.
Right. You can be identical with yourself, but you don't exemplify. Exemplify only applies to these universals. It's a technical term of art. Only these abstractions are said to be exemplified. Objects just exist, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
objects just exist.
yeah, that's all they can do. Properties exist and they can be exemplified, or not, at various times, right?
Properties exist and they can be exemplified.
Or not be exemplified, depending on the circumstances. Right, like the property of being a stegosaurus, right? Exists and it was exemplified hundreds of millions of years ago and not now.
You'd be acquainted with it, though.
Yeah,
I think I'm just wrestling with the concept internally.
yeah. But it wouldn't make sense to say like you're exemplified now and not later. If we said there was a property of being you, we could say that it was exemplified at one time. But that would be a different thing. That would be a property of you-ness, being
Of
you.
uniqueness.
Of being you. You know, that property might be had by some. exemplification is being had in a certain peculiar way. In the way that a thing has a quality. Like, this has the quality of being black and of being rectangular, right?
Nothing except for myself has the quality of being myself. Is that what it means?
Well, that's true, yeah. That would be a quality, though, that you'd be talking about, not about you. It'd be some special quality of you, quality of being yourself, if there is such a quality. Only you know it. Yeah. Okay, so we have these properties like being non-self-exemplifying. This would be a quality of anything that does not exemplify itself, including properties and objects that satisfy that description. All right. So, everything in this room would have that property.
Of being
Non-self-exemplifying, yeah.
I don't know why that term just doesn't, I don't know. I think
Well,
it's
because it's
something
not, because it's,
Exemplified that's catching you?
Yeah, I don't
Okay.
understand why the specific term exemplified was used.
oh, well, because that's a term that we start out with when we talk about properties.
Okay,
Properties are had by things,
okay.
and we call that having relation exemplification.
Relations to the.
Yeah, that's just what we call it.
Right, so things exemplify properties,
Yeah,
but things don't exemplify themselves.
no,
They only exemplify the properties.
yeah, that's just the way we use the term.
Progression.
Make sense?
Do you understand the concept?
Yeah, it took me a minute though. It took me a minute too because I was caught up on exemplify. I was like, what does that mean?
You could
But
say instantiate, exemplify, have.
represent.
Because it just sounds like
Yeah.
an identity symbol to me. Like,
Yeah.
I exemplify.
It's the relation of predication.
Is
Right.
anyone else confused, or is it just me?
Well, they have to see there's a progression and it's only a one-way progression.
So it has to do with predicating a general,
Way
it
of saying it, yeah.
has to do with predicating a general term of a specific individual. We call that relation exemplification when the individual realizes that quality which is predicated of it. So if we say you're wise, then we're predicating,
Quality I can exemplify.
yes, and we say she exemplifies wisdom, but this fool over here does not.
Right.
But no one can exemplify myself.
No, that's
Other
because,
chair-
because that's an object. You don't exemplify
That's
objects.
what I'm
It's-
saying, it's non-self-exemplifying.
Yeah,
Like this pen can never be exemplified.
Exactly.
Oh, okay, no, I get it. That was just like, I was doing a little bit.
yeah.
I don't exemplify chair,
Yeah,
No, you don't.
yeah.
even if I like contort my body.
Is there any property that can exist spatial temporally? Like, that can be exemplified, like, is there anything that can be exemplified that exists in a spatial temporal sense?
All of them.
They can if you believe in moderate realism, sure. Aristotle says these properties are in the things. They exist spatiotemporally, like dog and cat.
Okay.
So,
So
yeah,
everything is spatio-temporal.
for Aristotle, yeah. Except for God, maybe.
Yeah.
God transcends and is omniscient, omnipresent.
Well,
That's why
he
he's
doesn't
not-
use it. He used God for Aristotle is this like unmoved mover who makes the universe move because everybody admires his
Moving.
ability to not move and just think about thinking. Okay, on that note, we're going to stop. The exam opens up tonight, so and it'll be open for however long it says, quite a few days. It's going to be a thing like there would be 10 questions there, and I'm going to ask you to pick 5 of them and answer. Okay, don't answer it online or anything. Like type it up in a Word document, email, or bring it to class. Yeah, bring it to class. If you can't, email it to me before the due date. All that information. Answer the question as completely and accurately as you can. More accurate and more complete answers have the strong potential of getting a higher score than those